We're going to start. Gene, you ready? Committee on Oversight and Government Reform will come to order. Without objection, the Chair is authorized to declare a recess at any time. This afternoon, the United States Government, this morning, the United States Government Accountability Office released its annual report on duplicative Federal programs. It has been the case for the past 5 years. There is a vast opportunity for the Federal Government to save hard-earned taxpayer dollars. One day before Americans have to pay their taxes, the GAO report identifies 24 new areas where Federal Government agencies are wasting resources. To help remedy this waste and improve the effectiveness of our government, the report recommends more than 66 actions to save money. Some examples from this year's report include 8 Federal agencies administer more than 100 programs to support individuals with serious mental illness. The GAO also identifies 42 Federal, State, and local non-emergency medical transportation programs that currently lack coordination, leading to poor outcomes. And further, the GAO noted that the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, often referred to as NOAA, maintains 21 separate systems to monitor sea surface temperature and 14 to measure just ocean surface wind speeds. Even NOAA has admitted this level of redundancy is unnecessary. Finally, the report also draws new attention to the broken-down FOIA process at the Department of Homeland Security. Today, the Department of Homeland Security is responsible for more than half of all reported backlogged FOIA requests. This is completely unacceptable. All told, in the first 5 years of the report, GAO has identified more than 200 areas with wasted Federal resources. As a result, GAO has recommended more than 500 actions to save money and improve efficiency. By implementing about a third of these GAO recommendations in prior years, the government managed to save roughly $20 billion, which is a start, but more needs to be done. Addressing the remaining recommendations has the potential to save American taxpayers $80 billion by the year 2023. Over and again, the GAO's duplication reports have shown how precious dollars are wasted when Federal agencies fail to work together. GAO has specifically identified dozens of areas where increased guidance, oversight, and coordination from OMB would create greater efficiencies. These would also reduce costs to the taxpayers, including a way for the Federal Government to acquire needed goods and services. Yet OMB to date has only fully addressed about a third of GAO's recommended actions. It has to do better to fully justify the taxpayers' trust in its mission. With Americans projected to pay the government $1.5 trillion in individual income taxes, we must ensure greater return on taxpayer investment by reducing inefficiencies and redundancies. I want to thank the GAO for once again providing Congress and the executive branch with a roadmap to achieve the needed savings. There are literally thousands of good men and women who work tirelessly through the course of a year and beyond to develop these reports, and we very much appreciate it. Look forward to hearing from the witnesses on how the government can make greater progress in achieving a more efficient, effective, and accountable government. That's what we're all here to do, and this is a good opportunity for both sides of the aisle, the administration, the GAO, to all come together and discuss these topics and figure out how we can make more of the precious Federal dollars. I want to let members know that I will hold the record open for 5 legislative days for any members who would like to submit a written statement. We will now recognize our panel of witnesses. I'm pleased to welcome the Honorable Gene Dodaro, Comptroller General of the United States Government Accountability Office. Mr. Dodaro is accompanied by a panel of staff from the GAO behind him whose expertise may be needed during the questioning. We also have the Honorable Beth Cobert, Deputy Director for Management at the Office of Management and Budget. Did I pronounce it correctly? Okay, good. We welcome you. Pursuant to committee rules, all witnesses will be sworn before they testify. We will also swear in those accompanying Mr. Dodaro who may be offering testimony. And so if you all would rise. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Thank you. Let the record reflect that all members, all people who raised their hand answered in the affirmative. And prior to having our witnesses testify, we're going to now recognize the ranking member, Mr. Cummings from Maryland, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for holding what has become a critical annual hearing for our committee and for making sure that GAO's report gets the attention it warrants. Today's hearing will focus on GAO's 5th annual report on duplicative programs and opportunities for cost savings. It will allow us to zero in on areas where we can work together to cut waste and save money. That is what this committee is all about, and that is what our constituents expect of us. Unfortunately, today's report from GAO indicates that Congress has been doing far worse than the executive branch in implementing recommendations to eliminate duplication and to promote the efficiency and effectiveness of the federal government. According to GAO's report, the executive branch has fully or partially completed 86% of GAO's recommendations, while Congress is struggling around 45%. Clearly, Congress must do a better job of focusing on its own actions rather than trying to blame everything on the executive branch. Specifically, GAO has made 369 recommendations for the executive branch, and 317 have now been fully or partially completed. In contrast, GAO has made 69 recommendations for Congress, but only 31 of those have been fully or partially completed. This year's report from GAO highlights some areas where Congress could legislate to eliminate waste and duplication. For example, GAO recommended that Congress consider permanently rescinding the entire $1.6 billion balance of U.S. Enrichment Corporation Fund. According to GAO, Congress authorized this revolving fund in the U.S. Treasury for environmental cleanup costs associated with disposing of depleted uranium at 2 specific facilities and for expenses related to the fund's privatization. GAO has determined that both of the fund's purposes have been completed, but only Congress can permanently rescind the entire balance of the fund. Overall, it is clear that significant progress has been made in implementing GAO's recommendations over the past 4 years. GAO made a total of about 440 recommendations between 2011 and 2014, and about 348 of these have been fully or partially addressed by the executive branch in Congress. GAO estimates that these efforts have resulted in about $20 billion in financial benefits to date, with another $80 billion in savings projected through 2023. We must recognize these accomplishments and shine a light on them. We want them to become the model that we'll strive to achieve. And at the same time, it is also clear that more work simply needs to be done. For example, GAO identified potential duplication in laboratory inspections. GAO highlighted one laboratory that had been inspected 8 times by the Environmental Protection Agency and the Drug and Food Administration over an 8-year span. Of course, these facilities must be rigorously inspected, but if relevant information had been shared between the 2 agencies, they might have reduced duplication and been able to direct attention to other needed inspections. Better leveraging of resources and potentially increasing the number of facilities inspected serves not only the best interests of the agencies, but of the taxpayers as well. To conclude, I want to thank both of our witnesses, Mr. Dodaro and Ms. Colbert, for being here today. Mr. Dodaro, you and your talented staff are providing a critical service to the Congress and the American people by issuing this report. I also appreciate the work that you and your colleagues at GAO do every day to increase the effectiveness and efficiency of the federal government and to help ensure that our tax dollars are spent wisely. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. We'll now recognize Mr. Dodaro for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon to you, Ranking Member Congressman Cummings, members of the committee. I'm very pleased to be here today to discuss GAO's 2015 report. We identified 24 new areas with 66 recommendations. These include a recommendation to the Congress to create a formal coordinating group to focus on the oversight of consumer protection issues. There are 20 different agencies involved in this effort at least. There's fragmentation, overlap in responsibilities, and greater efficiencies that can be achieved, as well as better protection to the public. We also have recommendations for greater coordination among the 42 programs and 6 agencies that provide non-emergency medical transportation. Here, we're concerned that not enough cooperation has been gained yet from the Medicaid and VA programs, which are big players, and there's not a cost-sharing agreement in place. The Council coordinating this activity hasn't met since 2008. This is a big issue, particularly with the aging of our population and the need for these non-emergency medical services among the aged, the disabled, and those without the means to provide their own transportation for needed health care. We also identified a component of a provider within the DoD healthcare system that was set up originally in 1982. It's now being duplicated by the TRICARE program, which was established in the 1990s, and we recommend that that component can be eliminated, thus saving millions of dollars with a careful transition to ensure that nobody has interruption in services that are provided. We also recommend reexamination of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. With U.S. production now at record levels and reserves growing, both in the Strategic Petroleum Reserve and the in private sector reserves, we now hold much more than we have to meet international requirements in the reserve. This could free up potentially, based on the reexamination, oil that can be sold to reap billions of dollars that could be used for other government priorities, and also reduce the operating costs of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, which is aging and in need of further repair. We also identified areas that were established of 11 hospitals that provided cancer treatment in the 1980s, when most of cancer treatment was inpatient concern. Now, more hospitals can provide it. It's outpatient concerns. And if those hospitals were treated the same way other hospitals that are treating cancer payments now, and they had a level playing field, the federal government could save $500 million a year in Medicare spending, health care spending. So these are a few of the examples. As it's been mentioned, in the past 4 years, we've had over 440 recommendations. 37% have been fully implemented, 39% partially, 20% not at all. The amount of money that's been saved so far has been $20 billion in implementing our recommendations, with another $80 billion in the works that should be achieved in the coming years. But there's plenty of money left on the table here in areas that can produce additional $1 billion in savings and efficiencies. We've grouped them into a number of categories. You could be more aggressive on strategic sourcing to leverage the government's buying power. Right now, OMB is moving on this, as Beth will talk about, but we need to be more aggressive in setting targets and to achieve the savings that are necessary. In February, I was before this committee talking about IT operations and acquisitions. We put it on our high-risk list across government. Their concerted efforts could save millions of dollars, if not billions of dollars, in waste and inefficiencies in IT operations. We've got many recommendations to streamline activities at the Defense Department to reduce overhead, help control their health care costs, reduce the cost of weapon systems. We have recommendations to reform Medicare and Medicaid payment processes and oversight processes to reduce health care spending, which is much needed at this point in time. We've got recommendations to also increase tax revenues and to rationalize some benefit programs where there's some overlapping and duplication and benefit programs. So I appreciate the opportunity to be here today and discuss these areas in further detail during the questions and answer period when it's appropriate. Mr. Chairman, thank you very much.
Thank you. Appreciate that. We'll now recognize Ms. Cobert for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Chaffetz, Ranking Member Cummings, and distinguished members of the committee for inviting me to discuss the Federal Government's efforts to reduce fragmentation, overlap, and duplication across programs. I appreciate the opportunity to discuss this important area because it is critical that the Administration and Congress work together to advance reforms that help sustain a high-performing, cost-effective government. GAO is a key partner in OMB's efforts to create more efficiencies and cost savings. GAO's 2015 report provides helpful updates on actions the Administration and Congress have taken on recommendations from previous reports and offers new recommendations. I also particularly appreciate this opportunity to testify along with Comptroller Jean Dodaro. Whether it is the GAO high-risk list, this report, or other specific issues, Jean and I are regularly working together towards the common goal of creating positive outcomes for citizens and thoughtful and careful spending of taxpayer dollars. GAO's report recognizes some of the overall progress the Administration has made since the initial areas of fragmentation, overlap, and duplication were identified in 2011. The Executive Branch and Congress together have significantly engaged on 337 of the 440 broad areas GAO has identified over the past 4 years. Within these broad areas, the Executive Branch has made progress on 79% of GAO's recommendations, with 30% fully addressed and 49% partially addressed. The President's management agenda provides a strong foundation for tackling duplication, fragmentation, and overlap. The President's management agenda is built on 4 core pillars: effectiveness, efficiency, economic growth, and people and culture. By focusing on how we can simplify processes to make services better, finding ways to share best practices and information more effectively across the Federal Government and with the public, and leveraging the talents of America's Federal workforce, the Administration is driving an agenda that enables the government to operate more efficiently in the 21st century. Addressing the government's critical priorities requires focus, discipline, and collaboration, often across organizational boundaries. Whether it is in corporate, nonprofit, or government entities, in my experience, it boils down to prioritizing, focus, and working together. One key way that OMB helps support this prioritization and collaboration is through the Agency Priority Goal and Cross-Agency Priority Goals established as part of the Government Performance and Results Modernization Act, GPRA. The Administration is pleased to update you on progress in several specific areas related to GAO's extensive recommendations, as well as the President's management agenda. I'd like to share a few specific examples. Saving on real property costs. Through the Administration's Freeze the Footprint policy, agencies achieved a 21.4 million square foot reduction in office and warehouse space between FY12 and FY14. And in FY 2014 alone, the government disposed of 7,350 buildings, 47 million square feet of space, and eliminated $17 million of annual operation and maintenance cost as a result of Freeze the Footprint. We recently issued the National Strategy for Real Property, which builds on these efforts and requires agencies to reduce their real property footprint going forward. Acquisition. Through strategic sourcing efforts, the Administration has generated $417 million in savings and reduced contract duplication by up to 40% in targeted areas. But we know we need and can do more. We're building on this success through our category management efforts, an approach that allows us to further reduce duplicative acquisition practices and better leverage government-wide buying power and expertise. Smarter IT delivery. Through the data-driven portfolio stat process, the government has achieved more than $2.3 billion in savings in the past 3 years. around spending on IT. Eliminating homelessness through strong collaborative work across agencies, through the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness and community partnerships. The administration has made significant progress towards the President's ambitious goal of ending homelessness, particularly among veterans. Veterans' homelessness is down 33%, and people experiencing chronic homelessness on a single night is down 21%, with great cooperation across agencies on this effort. The FY16 budget also continues to propose reforms and target duplicative programs for reduction or elimination. In the President's first 6 budgets, the administration identified, on average, more than 150 cuts, consolidations, and savings, averaging more than $23 billion each year. We are also working to oversee the implementation of 2 new key pieces of legislation that will further strengthen efforts to improve efficiency and save taxpayer resources: the Digital Accountability and Transparency Act, the DATA Act, and the Federal Information Technology Reform Act, FITARA. Our efforts and success to date shows that we can improve the way government works and provide the American people with an efficient, effective, and high-performing government. We look forward to continuing to work with Congress and the GAO and other stakeholders to identify additional opportunities to create a government that makes a significant, tangible difference in the economy and the lives of the American people and spends its dollars wisely. I thank the committee for holding this hearing and for your commitment to improving Federal performance. I'd be pleased to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you. We'll now recognize the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Duncan, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this, what I think is a very, very important hearing. And I first want to join the ranking member, Mr. Cummings, in complimenting the GAO for the $20 billion in savings thus far, and what I see is the potential in $80 billion in the years ahead. One area that's of great interest to me for many years has been this disposal of excess Federal property. The Chairman and I both have worked on that for several years, and I noticed that the OMB says they have a national strategy in place, but the GAO says or does not agree. Can you explain why the GAO does not agree with the approach that OMB is taking on this thus far, Mr. Dodaro, and then we'll have Ms. Colbert respond.
Yes, the information in our report about the status of actions taken by agencies was as of March 6th last month. OMB's strategy just came out at the end of March, March 25th. So we believe that it's responsive to our recommendation in part, and are pleased that the national strategy has now been issued. It's a document that's going to require some additional development and support on the details to implement it, but it addresses some of our concerns so far. So we're pleased with the document, but it's a timing difference, Mr. Congressman.
Well, then another area that we held a hearing on last year was this $80 billion in annual purchases of new technology. And I'm wondering if you think that's an area where there are potentially some pretty big savings in that regard, because I know that they say that all the computers are obsolete the day they're taken out of the box. The technology is moving so fast, yet much of that technology, and it seems that any time a government agency has cost overruns or has real problems, they say their technology is out of date. And I'm wondering what's being done, if you feel enough is being done to take advantage of potential savings there, because a lot of that technology, even though it may not be brand new, is still very usable.
Yes. No, I do not think enough is being done. I think there have been some steps made. You know, I was so concerned about this area that I added it to our high-risk list across the Federal Government. There are really a couple dimensions. One is more money is going in to continue to support the legacy systems, the old systems from the past. And that's a trend that's different than what's happening in other parts of the economy. And we think more can be done there to review ongoing spending operations to see if there can be greater efficiencies and drive down the cost. Secondly, OMB has moved forward on the data center consolidations, looking at the portfolio for duplicative investments, doing these tech stat assessments on troubled projects that are high risk. But much more needs to be done to be consistently implemented across government. There are huge opportunities here to get better service at less cost.
Also, I noticed, I know that all of us favor a strong national defense, but your report says that the Department of Defense may be underestimating some of the total resources dedicated to the supporting the headquarters staff. And I'm wondering if you could give us a little more specific information on that. And then also, I've read over the last several months that even many former chiefs of staff and former secretaries of the last, I think, 3 secretaries of defense have said that military personnel costs are spiraling out of control, and we're not going to be able to buy some of the necessary weapons and equipment that we need if something's not done. What do you have to say about in those areas?
Yeah, definitely military costs are something we point out as a big cost driver, along with healthcare costs. Healthcare costs are on an escalating course, just as they are in other sectors of the economy. With regard to the headquarters operations, I'll ask Kathy Berry, who's our expert in defense. But basically, Congressman, they're only looking at certain aspects of their headquarters operations when we believe they ought to be looking more broadly across the department. And as a result, they're not seeing good opportunities, as many opportunities as we believe need to be reviewed, and they need to do it on a regular basis. Kathy?
Sure. There's really 2 issues with the growth and management headquarters of the Department of Defense. The first issue is there has been significant growth, and DOD hasn't been doing a periodic reevaluation of resources dedicated to headquarters. So, for example, we recently issued a report looking at the 3 functional combatant commands. There's about 10,500 civilian and military personnel dedicated to headquarters at these 3 commands. That's grown over 50% in the last 10 years. And that is a similar trend that we've seen across the geographic combatant commands, OSD, the Joint Staff, and other organizations. So we think that DOD needs to do a periodic reassessment of resources devoted to those entities. The second issue is DOD is pursuing cuts within its management headquarters functions at the department. The Secretary of Defense directed a 20% cut. The problem is, as the Comptroller General mentioned, it's focused on a very small percentage of the headquarters within DOD. So, for example, at the functional combatant commands that I referenced, there's 10,500 personnel, headquarters personnel dedicated. These cuts will only apply to less than a quarter of those personnel. So we've recommended that DOD look more broadly at all of its headquarters personnel versus just this small, relatively small portion called management headquarters.
Well, thank you very much. I will say this. We need more fiscal conservatives at the Pentagon, I can tell you, and I appreciate the job you all are doing in that regard.
Thank the gentleman. We'll now recognize the gentlewoman from the District of Columbia, Ms. Norton, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I note that tomorrow is so-called tax day, April 15th, and that I'm going to really be interested in next year's report because it looks like the Congress has shot itself in the foot and added to the deficit by what it's done to the IRS. I've never seen anything like it. The reports all over the country are of people waiting in line to get audits and other questions answered. As of April 15th, you could get no information, and before that, you could get very little information, and if so, you had to go to the tax advocate. This is a recipe for inefficiency in an agency that we depend upon if we want to reduce our deficit. Now, of course, much of that is going to come out in some way. I suspect, Mr. Darrow, in your report next year, but this so-called tax gap is, I believe, already showing it. The most recent figures I've been able to get about the tax gap, that's the difference between what people owe in taxes and what they actually report. The figure I get is close to $400 billion or $385 billion. That sound about right? Look what that would mean for the deficit if we could just get those funds. Now, a lot of this is due not just to people avoiding taxes, but underreporting, so they need to talk to somebody, and in order to talk to somebody, there needs to be an audit. You can't just say, give us the money. By the way, Mr. Dodaro, I read that the IRS is saying up front now, in light of what looks like a 17% cut, that's the figure that sticks in my mind. That's way times more during the sequester than any other agency. That the IRS is saying, unless it amounts to $1 million, sorry, we can't even look at your at auditing to look to see whether you're underreporting. In other words, home free. They're saying up front because of this unusual cut that shoots ourselves in the foot, the gut, you name it. Now, if one looks at your report today, we find talk of backlogs and audits. And here I am looking at the years 2013 and 14, which coincided with these cuts. Isn't that correct?
I'd have to.
When there's been backlogs for taxpayers needing audits in order for the IRS to collect what is due to the people of the United States.
I'm going to ask Jay McTiger, who heads up our IRS work, to respond.
Yes, Congressman. Over the last several years, since about 2010, the audit rate for individuals is down about 25%, and the audit rate for businesses larger than $10 million in assets has also declined, in that case, about 30%.
Heavens, are we ever going to be able to collect that money? Is there a statute of limitations? I mean, if it's down by that because you don't have the staff, and you obviously don't, they obviously don't have the staff, is that money gone for the taxpayers?
Generally, IRS has 3 years from the time a taxpayer files his or her tax return to complete an audit.
With these backlogs, I can't imagine that some people just aren't off scot-free just by virtue of the statute of limitations. I think we have to note that. The IRS budget has been reduced by $1.2 billion over 5 years. That's an amount that's kind of inconceivable. Isn't that approximately correct?
Yes, Congressman.
With that kind of reduction, and you've got to decide what you've got to do. They've already decided they can't take care of you and me because we're too far down on the totem pole. What in the world can they do?
Well, in that respect, we have made a number of recommendations on how our IRS can more efficiently use the resources that they have. For example, to get return on investment information, we identified if they shifted $124 million from field exams to correspondence audits, they can increase revenue by $1 billion during that period of time. There's also things the Congress can do to help the IRS. For example, we've recommended that paid tax preparers have some certification requirements and that the Congress give IRS the authority to do that. Most of the tax returns are prepared by paid tax preparers. Last time we looked at this, we did undercover operations. Only 2 of the 19 paid tax preparers gave the right answers to the questions.
So Congress should do what with respect to that?
Give IRS the authority to regulate paid tax preparers. And also,
By the way, they regulate VitaSites, volunteer. The VitaSites, all of us have it in our jurisdictions, where volunteers have to be certified tax preparers. Those are complete volunteers, but they've been certified by the IRS. They save the American people billions upon billions, and they don't have to pay for it.
and the biggest thing Congress could do is simplify the tax code.
You're right on that, Mr. Dodaro. Thank you.
Thank the gentleman. I'll now recognize myself for 5 minutes. Ms. Colbert, appreciate you being here. One of the things you mentioned was the following up on what Jimmy Duncan from Tennessee was talking about is the underutilized property. It is something he has worked on, I've worked on, Mr. Mike has worked on. I mean, we have literally tens of thousands of buildings that are underutilized at this point. Freeze the footprint. One of the things I guess I would want you to consider, or at least think through, when you talk about acquisitions, one of the things that drives us a bit nuts out west is the acquisition budget within the Department of Interior. We have a $10+ billion backlog with the national parks and monuments and whatnot. I mean, the gems of this country, and yet we've got more than a $10 billion backlog, but at the same time, we're acquiring more property. Have you given any consideration to stopping or slowing down or freezing the footprint in terms of acquisitions within the Department of Interior as well?
Thank you for your question, Congressman. As we think about real estate and the portfolio as a whole, what we've tried to do is to take a very data-driven approach to understand our starting point, where we're going, and what the needs are. What are buildings used for today, and do they still fulfill the purpose that they had? What are the new purposes for which real estate is needed and important to do that way? So to try and get that balance right and to use that data in better decision-making across.
And I guess what I don't see in your consideration, and Mr. Doro, I don't know if you've looked at this, but the acquisition budget is roughly $500 million to acquire additional properties within the Department of Interior, and yet we still have a $10 billion backlog. What I don't see is the same freeze the footprint approach prevailing within the Department of Interior. Am I wrong on that?
The acquisition of properties for different purposes, you have to go back and say, what are we acquiring those properties for? I don't have the specifics of the programs on the Department of Interior, but I do know we are trying to think about what buildings and what properties we have for which purpose, and can we use those or reuse those or find
And
a
a lot
way
of
to
these
dispose
aren't
of them.
actual buildings. A lot of them
Land.
are lands. And Mr. Dodaro, or
Mr. Gaffigan is our expert in this area.
Mr. Chairman, we have some ongoing work. We haven't been looking at the Park Service in a long time. There are 407 different park units throughout the country, ranging from Yosemite to small little sites like the Rosie DeRiveter historic site.
you can go ahead and mention Arches, which happens to be in Utah's 3rd congressional district, one of the most beautiful places you can visit.
I didn't want to be
Yes?
I didn't want to be too obvious, but
Go ahead. You're my full permission.
yeah,
It's beautiful.
yeah, and you know, they're struggling to deal with what they have right now, and this is our first look at it in a while, and because the only sources of revenue come from potential park fees, concessions, and they're really struggling to deal with what they have right now. So we have some ongoing work looking at that issue right now.
And I guess on behalf of those out west, this is of keen concern because the acquisitions continue. I think you've highlighted the problem. I just worry that you have not yet also included the Department of Interior, because these are typically old buildings and pieces of property and other acquisitions. They all sound great, but then the problem is at the Grand Canyon and at Arches and at Canyonlands and places all across, we've got backlog that doesn't get taken care of, and right now that's to the tune of $10+ billion, and you don't have things like campsites and waste removal and very basic things that people, as they get out, enjoy the outdoors. So, and to the GAO, we would appreciate if you can continue to look at that as well. I've got a host of other ones, but we've got other members here. I'm going to go ahead and yield back, but thank you for your consideration on that. We'll now recognize Ms. Kelly from Illinois, I believe is next on the list, and we'll recognize her for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Dodaro, one issue identified in today's GAO report as an area of potential cost savings is the management of information technology investments. This is particularly important area to invest in, given our committee's growing focus on cybersecurity, and to me as a ranking member on the IT subcommittee. Today's GAO report estimates that at least $79 billion will be spent on information technology by the federal government in fiscal year 2015. Is that accurate?
Yes, that is.
And in your opinion, what opportunities exist for reducing duplication and improving efficiency in this area?
There are billions of dollars that can be saved in that area. I'll have Mr. Powner as our expert in the IT area. He can enumerate for you.
Yeah, probably the key area is data center consolidation. Right now we have 9,000 data center consolidation. We have 9,700 data centers, of which about 4,000 are planned to be closed. We've accomplished about 1,200 closures to date and about $1.5 billion in savings, but there's still about $6 billion on the table. So When the comptroller mentions 60 more billion in savings, you could get $6 billion right from data centers alone.
And how many employees does that affect in a negative way, like losing their jobs?
Well, actually, there's a lot of repurposing of jobs. The other thing, too, is some of these centers are rather small centers where there's portions of FTEs that are associated with that. So it's not all jobs going away. But again, we only have 10% utilization on an average government server. That's nowhere near the industry standard of 60, and we need to do something about that.
Okay, thank you. Also, OMB in 2012 launched the Portfolio Stat Initiative. Under this program, agencies were required to review their IT investments in order to make more efficient decisions. How does a portfolio stat help reduce wasteful spending by federal agencies?
Yes, so portfolio stat really tackles duplicative, what we refer to as commodity IT or business systems. And if you look at, there are about 200 initiatives across all the departments and agencies where we could save an additional probably $2 to $3 billion. The numbers fluctuate at times. But in addition to the data center savings of 7.5, there's roughly $2 to $3 billion in that range. And there's already been many accomplishments to date that I think Beth mentioned in her statement on the savings to date with portfolio stat. So we've gotten out of the gate well, but there's still a lot on the table. And that's where the recent legislation that this committee sponsored is critical to drive this home to closure so that we accomplish all those savings.
If I could add, we've worked closely with GAO on these issues, and the ability to get better data and better control over the spending through actions like FTAR, through the work of this committee, really gives us a foundation for something we have to keep managing very closely going forward.
Yeah, we prefer to call it Isaac Connolly up here, but
Using my time. This year's GAO report states, and I quote, while the 26 federal agencies required to participate in portfolio stat have made progress in implementing OMB's initiative, weaknesses existed in agencies' implementation of the initiative. Do you feel like that's correct?
Yeah, that is true. There's still room for improvement. In fact, we're issuing another report on portfolio stat this Thursday, and it's going to talk about additional steps that need to occur. One of the things that's critical here is OMB's oversight as well as congressional oversight with FTAR is critical because the agencies, they get out of the gate real aggressively, and then over time you start to see that the savings that are planned aren't actually accomplished. So OMB's oversight and the Congress's oversight with FTAR and the reporting will be essential.
Well, I want to thank you so much, and I sincerely hope that we can work together to achieve the nearly $6 billion in savings with the proper implementation of the program. So thank you so much.
would my friend yield?
Yes, your friend.
I thank my colleague. Just real briefly, let me urge upon you. I hope that because you've been enthusiastic supporters of the acquisition reform for IT, OMB and GAO, I hope, can work with us in setting metrics. General Dodaro, for example, you mentioned data center consolidation. Well, we actually went, as you may recall in our field hearing, we went in the wrong direction. We didn't consolidate. We actually discovered thousands of new ones. And so we've got to set metrics for agencies, and they got to meet them, and they got to know you're going to be reporting at least annually on that. I know my friend Mr. Meadows shares my concern, and we're going to use our subcommittee to get periodic progress reports. But anything you two can do to enshrine that in metrics, I think would be a great help, and people will benefit from it. Thank you. Thank my friend.
I thank the gentlelady. The chair recognizes the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Mulvaney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks, everybody, for doing this. This is actually one of the enjoyable hearings that we get to do. If you were here earlier today, you got an example of the unenjoyable ones. Mr. Dodaro, start with you and some general inquiries. I'm curious as to how we can help. I was struck by Mr. Cummings' opening comment saying that Congress is actually sort of lagging behind the executive branch when it comes to fixing things. Give me a couple of examples for me and my colleagues as to what Congress could be doing to help implement your recommendations. What have we ignored so far?
Yeah, well, there's, to put things in perspective, though, of the amount of money that's been saved so far, planned to be saved, the $100 billion, the 80, and the 20 so far, most of that has come through the Congress passing legislation. So I think, for balance purposes, I think Congress has taken some actions that have resulted in probably about 75 or 80% of the dollar savings has come from the Congress taking action on a number of areas. So I wanted to put that in perspective. There are a number of areas in this area. One, I mentioned some in the IRS areas right now. You could also increase the requirements for electronic filing that would give IRS more data to be able to use, give them increased information sharing areas. We have recommendations on how CMS ought to adjust the Medicare Advantage payments for Medicare payments, fee-for-service payments that could result in about at least $2 to $3 billion in increased savings. I mentioned in my opening statement these 11 cancer hospitals that were established in 1982. They have a different payment method. They get reimbursed all their costs, where other hospitals that are providing cancer treatment get reimbursed at negotiated rates. Put them on a level playing field, you can save $500 million a year right there. I mentioned the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. Energy is going to move in that area. Congress should pay oversight in that area. We have recommendations that there are duplicative situations that are unintended, where you have somebody receiving a disability benefit and an unemployment benefit at the same time. Changing that statutorily would save about $1.2 billion.
Do we need to change that statutorily? Can that be done from an administrative or regulatory position?
I believe it has to be statutory, but I'll double-check and provide an answer for the record on that.
Gotcha.
There's also, we're not offsetting, the government's not offsetting pensions for state and local governments from Social Security benefits for spousal and survivor benefits. The administration has made proposals in this area to get this corrected for the last 4 years, and we think they're right, and the Congress just needs to pass legislation in this area. This is where, for Federal employees, they have the information, they can offset it, but state and local governments don't pay into some of their pension systems, they don't pay into Social Security. So they get a separate benefit, and the Federal law says that should be offset in that area, over time. There's also area where through demonstration projects right now, the administration has the ability to approve tens of billions of dollars in additional Medicaid spending without the Congress having any insight into it. And we believe that that spending has not been budget neutral, and according to the policies for HHS, and we think that that could be attended to as well, to deal with these health care spendings. We've also suggested there's a component in the DoD health system that was established in 1982, and before TRICARE was established in the 90s. Now TRICARE offers the same benefits as this component within DoD. We think that could be eliminated, could save millions of dollars. That has to be done statutorily.
Stick with me on DoD, because you've mentioned that a couple times in your testimony to the other members. Talk to me about weapons procurement. I think everybody in here is interested in a strong national defense, but everybody in here is also interested in doing it a little more cost-effective way. You've got some interesting recommendations, don't you, on weapons acquisition, weapons program acquisitions?
Yes, yes, yeah. We found that there are many reviews within the system that are duplicative and take years to complete and thousands of man-hours to be able to handle those things. I'll ask Paul Francis to explain, but we think the weapons systems acquisition process can be streamlined from a process standpoint, but they also need to implement best practices to mature technologies before they go into production. Both things have the potential to save tens of billions of dollars.
Good afternoon. So what Mr. Dodaro just said, on the efficiencies, we found that for a major milestone decision, it takes 2 years for programs to get all the documents lined up for that. 5,600 staff days. And we find half of that time is reviewing documents, not preparing them.
Is that just for the big programs, or is that for the smaller ones as well?
The ones we looked at are for the big programs.
Okay.
Right. I think we did a survey, about half, the participants in the process view about half of the documents as having high value, the rest not. And about 10% of the reviews are considered to be high value. So there's a lot that could be streamlined there. Then on the other programs, the issue there is getting a good start, having a good business case to start a program. And that's where best practices and other techniques could really take hold. We get programs started that are underestimated at the beginning. They're too technically ambitious at the start. It's years after a program's underway that reality sets in and we report on these cost increases. So the easy answer is there's practices that we could employ to get programs started earlier. The real challenge is the acquisition culture. So I think a common way of looking at the acquisition process is to say it's broken and needs to be fixed. But I'd ask you to look at it a little differently. I think it's in equilibrium. I think all the players kind of get what they want out of it, and the cost we pay in terms of additional time and money is just the cost of doing business. So we have to have a process that does a better job of saying no when no is to be said, but our process prefers to say yes.
I could do this all afternoon, but unfortunately, I don't have that time. Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Liu.
Thank you. Let me first thank the panel for your public service. And I have questions about the laboratory inspections in the report. And it's my understanding that both the EPA and the FDA conduct laboratory inspections. Is that correct?
Yes.
And based on reports analysis, many of the regulations are very similar for both these agencies.
Yes, yes.
And as a result, for example, some laboratories in Maryland and Illinois were inspected by both agencies. One in Maryland was inspected 8 times by the EPA and FDA, roughly in the same time period. Is that correct?
Yes.
Do these agencies talk to each other before they go do these inspections?
Yeah, I'll ask Mr. Gaffigan to talk about it. They used to have a formal agreement, which has expired, and we're recommending they reinstate the agreement. I think it mostly had to do with one of the agencies moving to a quarterly inspection process and from an annual process, and they got out of sync, and so they haven't talked to one another the way that they should, and both have had trouble staffing even the inspections that they do. Mark?
Mr. Dodaro is correct. They haven't coordinated since 2007, so our recommendation was they come up with a memorandum of agreement to start working better together.
Are these surprise inspections, or do the folks know they're coming?
I believe most of the time they know they're coming, but I can get you an official answer for the record.
It could be as simple as just notifying the other agency, right, that they're about rocket science.
Yeah, this is not complicated.
Okay.
You know, we do work at NASA. That is rocket science, but this isn't.
When did that agreement that they used to have expire? Do you remember?
2007 or 4?
I think it's in that 2004, 2007 range.
Yeah.
Would these only 2 agencies you sort of found duplication in terms of laboratories, in terms of inspections?
These are the 2 that will do lab inspections, looking at the good laboratory practices, which, as you mentioned, are very similar in their criteria. So there are other labs and other inspections, but this has a specific purpose to ensure that they have good laboratory practices.
Yeah, and this can have, if the inspections aren't done properly, it can have implications for the industry as well, because they need to have the certification that they meet these requirements. And so that's one of the things we point out in the report. So this has not only implications for the federal government not leveraging its resources properly, but for industry as well.
Do you also look at duplication between other levels of government, such as state or county?
Yeah, we're starting to do that now. The statutory requirement we have to produce this report is confined to across the federal government, but I believe there are areas of opportunity in streamlining across federal, state, and local governments. And we're starting a pilot program now in the housing area to look at that, and I plan to do other areas. It's a complicated analysis because most of the states are different, and they don't have standard procedures, but we have a very complicated intergovernmental delivery system in our country that I believe is pretty expensive, and I'm not sure we can afford to maintain it going forward. So I want to move into that area into the future.
I came from the California State Legislature, and I had noticed duplication in various areas. So I'm glad you're moving in that direction. I remember looking at weights and measures, and some supermarkets would get inspected. Pretty much exactly the same thing by the federal, state, and city. So I commend you for going that area, and I yield back the the balance of my time.
Yeah, actually, I have an advisory group of state auditors and local auditors that advise us. Elaine Howe, the state auditor from California, is on that group. And so we're working collaboratively with state and local auditors as well.
Great, thank you.
Congressman, just to clarify your question, they had the agreement from 1984 to 2004, although they kept meeting until 2007.
I thank the gentleman. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Iowa, Mr. Blum.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for being here today. Appreciate your service to the government. I'm a career small businessman, so I may be one of the few here that A, gets into this, and B, I personally think the GAO is one of the most important departments in our federal government. I'm also new here. I'm a freshman congressman, so I get a pass when I get to ask these dumb questions. First question. There are 24 programs, I believe, on your report for duplication of services. If you were a betting man, how many do you think are going to be on that report next year that were on the report this year?
Two-thirds.
Two-thirds. And how about in
But I'm not a betting man, just for the record.
We can strike that from the minutes. How many will be on the report that are on the report this year in 2017?
I'd say about half.
2018?
Still about half.
Yeah, and this is part of the problem. When I go back to my district in Iowa, people say the federal government spends too much, regulates too much, and wastes too much. Being a private sector guy, your department does a fantastic job of identifying these problems. What we're concerned about with is the A in GAO, which I believe stands for accountability.
That's correct.
Who is accountable for eliminating this duplication of services next year and the year after? Who's accountable for eliminating waste in the federal government?
It's both the administration and the Congress. That's why we have keeping separate scores for what actions we've recommended that the Congress has to take and what actions the administration has to take. And that's how we define accountability. Now, accountability gets fuzzy when multiple agencies are involved in fixing a problem. And really, our government structure is not well postured to deal with problems that involve multiple agencies. In the executive branch, OMB would have to take action, but they have limited resources and the ability to produce change across time. And in the Congress, you have multiple committee jurisdictions, and so it's difficult to solve problems. 40% of what we've recommended that involve a single agency have been addressed. Only 25% where multiple agencies are involved have been addressed. And that's where I think the real weakness is in how we're organized, both in the executive branch and the Congress.
As a new person here, it seems to me that almost everything in the federal government is top-down when compared to the private sector. Would you agree with that?
I'm not sure I would say everything's top-down. I think there's a lot of things that go on throughout the bureaucracy that the top doesn't know about, you know, and so I think there's, you know, it's like parallel universes. I think that there's, you know, no such thing as a command and control structure except in the military that works effectively.
Something I've noticed in the first 90 days here is it seems to me the incentives in Washington, D.C., the incentives in federal government are backwards. And I'd like to ask you this. What incentive is there for a rank-and-file federal employee to eliminate waste? What incentive is there for a rank-and-file federal employee to eliminate duplication of services? In the private sector, there's incentives. What incentives are there in the federal government for that to happen?
No,
I'm not seeing them.
Right, right. No. You're astutely observing one of the more enduring problems in the government is that the incentives are more perverse than they are in the proper direction. And, you know, there's more incentive to make sure that you have the budget necessary. There's more incentive to pay quickly and then worry about whether you paid the right person later. There's more incentive to build structures. Now, they're all well-intended in terms of trying to accomplish the mission of their agencies, but there's really, you know, aside from an individual's sort of view on what their role as federal government should be as being a good public servant, there aren't really built-in systematic incentives to help produce the right outcomes.
Because it seems to me that the incentive is to spend the entire budget, or our budget will get cut next year. And do you think there's a chance we can introduce some best practices from the private sector into the federal government so that it comes from bottom up instead of top down, eliminating duplication, waste, fraud from the rank and file federal employees, and when someone identifies it, that they are actually rewarded for that? Is there a chance of that?
Yes, yes. I mean, we've looked at a lot of best practices and have tried to get them implemented in agency policies and moving things forward, but they run against this tension that occurs in the backdrop. And it's really exacerbated, too, by the fact that we're not producing regular budgets on time in the federal government. I mean, in the last 50 years, I think we've only had 3 instances where we've passed a budget without some form of continuing resolution for the rest of the government. So when you're in an uncertain budget environment, that complicates even if you have a good incentive structure in place. So I think we have to get to a regular order, and then we can, work to build better incentives into the system.
My time is up, but once again, I'd like to commend the GAO and yourself on the outstanding work that you do.
Thank you.
And I yield back to the chair.
I thank the gentleman. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Illinois, Ms. Duckworth.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Dodaro, I was pleased to see that you included in your report the savings the government is already realizing from the Army's choice not to introduce a new family of camouflage uniforms into its inventory. Your report notes that this will save taxpayers about $4.2 billion over the next 5 years. And in fact, I offered the amendment in the 2014 NDAA that requires DOD to establish a joint camouflage pattern when developing new combat uniforms, so that the taxpayers won't have to pay millions to the government to keep developing new patterns for every branch of service that also sometimes don't protect troops in combat, such as the Navy's blueberry uniform that they can't wear on ships because when they fall overboard, they are blended with the ocean, and you can't actually rescue the sailors. Can you give me an update on where DOD's compliance is with this requirement?
Yes. Let me ask Ms. Barrick to come and provide that. I appreciate your sponsorship of the amendments. It was very important. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question. There has been significant progress. In fact, we identified that DOD saved over $5 billion in savings from pursuing a consolidated uniform moving forward. When we started the work and issued last year's duplication, or the year before's duplication report, the Army was getting ready to move forward with a procurement for their own camouflage uniform. But thanks to the legislation that you helped sponsor, which required DOD to pursue this in a more coordinated fashion, they did in fact do that and made some progress. In addition, DOD issued some joint criteria to ensure that the protection of the service members on the battlefield when they're developing uniforms, and that they do that in a coordinated fashion as well. So there has been some good progress.
That's good to hear. Thank you. In reviewing the GAO report, Ms. Colbert, is it Colbert or Colbert?
Colbert's correct.
All right, thank
Not
you.
Colbert.
Not Colbert. I almost went there, but I didn't. So.
Most people do.
We've all been trained by popular cable shows. I noted that better management of software licenses is noted as an area where savings can be achieved. Can you please help me understand OMB's view on how agencies can better manage their software licenses? Specifically, I'd like to hear how OMB believes agencies should inventory that software, see how much of it is actually deployed to end users, and how much of what's deployed is actually being put to use. If you can't inventory it, how can you effectively control waste if you can't inventory it?
Thank you for raising this issue, and I also want to thank our colleagues at GAO for raising this issue in the report. It is something that we believe is important to address, and working with them and working with agencies, we are moving to tackle that. One of the first places starts where you said, which is having an accurate inventory of software licenses. Software and IT purchasing across the federal government has been highly decentralized, both among inside of agencies and components within agencies, as well as across agencies. One of the first steps that we're taking as part of our category management initiative around IT is to develop a much more accurate inventory of licenses that exist and the utilization of those licenses today. As the way agencies use software changes, for example, as we are succeeding in moving more to the cloud, the ability to have a consolidated view of licenses becomes much easier, and the ability to be smarter about how to manage those licenses, how to think about what you're paying for those licenses, how to make sure that these things are current and used and you're not paying for what you don't need, becomes much easier. So we are in the midst of an effort to do that now. As I mentioned earlier, the FATARA legislation gives us more authorities in terms of how we get agencies to consolidate and coordinate their buying. And as we're putting together the guidance for that newly enacted law, this is one of the areas that we're focusing on. It is a big priority for our Federal CIO, who just joined us from industry, so really brings a lot of the best practices that industry is using to this important area. Something we're going to be a big focus for our work in 2015.
Thank you. Are any of those, is there a practice in Federal government where licenses are automatically renewed and nobody's reviewing whether or not we're actually using old licenses? They've gone on and bought new software packages, but we're still paying for stuff that's automatically renewed?
I don't have the specifics of that, but in my life in the private sector, when I looked at these issues, you would find many instances of that, and I wouldn't be surprised if my colleagues would tell me that were the case, at least in some places.
Yeah, the key here starts with the inventories, Congresswoman. Our work has showed that when we looked at software licensing, the 24 agencies, only 2 had a complete inventory. We had 22 agencies that did not have a complete inventory.
Oh, my.
So, and there's a big effort afoot, part of OMB's efforts with Portfolio Stat, looking at application rationalization. What do we have on our servers, inventorying all that. So it wouldn't be surprising if you had many licenses that we don't even know that are getting renewed. There's huge opportunities here. There's pockets of success. DHS went through some really nice efforts where they saved hundreds of millions of dollars. There's hundreds of millions of dollars on the table if we did this right, but we really don't know what we have right now collectively.
Thank you very much. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentlewoman. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Heiss.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'd like my other colleagues, thank you both for being here and all that you do. Of course, you've just got a critical responsibility, and we appreciate the information that you provide. It just, I think we all know, and probably most of us would readily admit, the obvious appearances we've created a monster around here, and you guys are tasked with the responsibility of keeping us aware of just how big that monster is and what we can potentially do to rein it in a little bit. And I wonder, in that context, with all the duplication that you've mentioned, are there any areas that you would just come out and be able to identify as unnecessary, that we've got so much duplication that this area or the other one we could just do away with? I'll start with you, Mr. Dodaro.
There's not been an area where we've said you could do away with all activity in a particular area. I mean, most of those are policy judgments that would require the Congress to say there's not a need in this particular area for you to do that. We have, recommended where you clearly have duplication, and this year's our prime example is this institution that was created in 1982 within DOD. It was well intended. It was a public service function that was turned over to DOD to help serve the military and their families. But then TRICARE came along about 15 years later, and as typical in the federal government, we just layer things on. Right. We don't never go back and take anything away, and so now the same people can be served by the TRICARE community, and you don't need this separate system. And when Congress created this, it gave DOD a difficult task because they can't even get the information from the providers in this contract to know what their direct costs are and what profit margins and administrative costs are. So they're really disadvantaged of this area. So we're identifying where you have clear duplication, you can eliminate that duplication, save a lot of money. That's been most of our focus.
Okay. Ms. Cober, do you have anything to add to that?
I'd like to add to Jean's comments about the need to both think about areas where there are duplication and where there are areas where there may be more fragmentation or overlap that you're not able to address immediately through some other structure, is finding a way to coordinate across agencies. One area we did that quite successfully is looking at science, technology, engineering, and math education, where we looked at the effectiveness of programs, put together a 5-year plan. We've reduced the number of programs from 220 to 140, and now have those programs much more balanced and effective. It's a critical area of importance for our nation's future, and what we tried to do in that is get the interagency process to say who's doing the best job at each one of these things, and then reallocate within that to the people who had the best capabilities. Those kinds of processes can work. They take a lot of work to make happen.
Sure they do. I'm positive of that. Do you find, and that's a great example, do you find most of the time that these agencies follow your recommendations, or is that a challenge in itself?
Our experience over a 4-year period of time, 80% of our recommendations get implemented. And what we feature in our high-risk series and this overlap and duplication report are those where they haven't yet been implemented that require some difficult decisions. They're among the more difficult areas in the federal government. But also, to your earlier question, one of the things that's really inhibited us from making stronger recommendations about whether you need to retain some of these functions is the lack of good performance evaluations in the federal government. And Beth just mentioned in the science, technology, and engineering area, when we first looked at, there were 209 programs. 66% of them had never been evaluated. So you really didn't know what was working and what was not working. And this is not atypical across the federal government.
Okay, what about some of the issues you brought up with the DOD? We hinted around this, but the enormous amount of property and facilities that they own. In my understanding, 53% of it is all that they can really account for in terms of being utilized, and even a lot of that information is inaccurate. This has got to be problematic. I'm sure you've given recommendations. Are they following the recommendations that you've provided?
Yeah, I'll ask Ms. Barrick to explain in that area, but I was very concerned. They've made such incremental progress in correcting the data in their database. It was almost imperceptible. But they need to do a lot better job. If you're going to intelligently manage things, you need better data. Kathy?
Yeah, and I'll start off by saying that GAO's designated this actually a high-risk area for DOD, that they get a better handle on their property. But just to give you a few statistics, DOD has over 500,000 real property entities. That's valued at about $850 billion. So the magnitude of this is really enormous. DOD manages the real property through a database. As you mentioned, most of the records in that database are blank. There's only data elements for about 53% of those facilities. In addition, the data that's there, there's lots of inaccuracies. So, for example, we found another 7,500 records that showed a 0% utilization record in their database, yet it was shown in active status, which means it's needed for DOD to meet its mission. During the course of our work, we actually visited 12 installations to see if we could find facilities, just visiting those 12, that were underutilized or unutilized. And by the way, this is important because those facilities could be disposed of to achieve savings, or underutilized facilities could be consolidated to achieve savings. At just those 12 facilities, we identified a number of examples, 4 buildings specifically, that were sitting empty. They weren't reflected on the property management records, and there was an opportunity with those 4 to potentially dispose of them or consolidate space. So we'll continue to monitor it. DOD's made some incremental improvements in their data. They recognize it's a problem, but more work remains.
I think this is an area for congressional direction to DOD that works effectively through the authorization bills to get their act together in this area.
Right. I thank you. My time's expired, but if you could send us some information as to why they have not gotten to this, I think that would be helpful.
Sure.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Be happy.
I thank the gentleman, and the chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Michigan, Ms. Lawrence.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you for being here today on this Liquid Sunshine Day. The report issued by GAO details major progress made by the executive agencies and Congress. Based on this year's report, it looks like Congress is not doing as well as the executive branch at implementing the GAO recommendations on waste, fraud, and abuse. According to the report, GAO made 369 recommendations to the executive branch, and 317 of those recommendations have been fully implemented. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. The report also stated that 69 recommendations for Congress were made, and only 31 of those have been fully or partially completed. Is that correct?
Yes.
So your agency is often called the congressional watchdog by investigating how federal government spends tax dollars, and you are the ones that are supposed to identify those and make sure that we're aware of it and make recommendations. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. So can you, I know we have a short period here, but can you sum up, talk to me about the 31 recommendations made to Congress in its report that deal directly with waste or abuse that has not been completely addressed?
Right. We've made recommendations, for example, on this eliminating the overlap between the disability benefits and unemployment insurance, some people receiving those at the same time. We've made recommendations on crop insurance, for example, that there be limits placed on the amount of subsidies for purchasing the premiums on crop subsidies. We believe that could save a couple $2 billion. And Congress a while ago changed the taxes on certain tobaccos for cigars and cigarettes, but the industry moved to using less taxed items, like roll your own tobacco instead of, so there's an unlevel playing field. We believe if Congress could implement those changes, you'd get about $600 billion or $1 billion more in revenues by level the playing field on tobacco taxes. We've recommended many changes to the IRS to help deal with their challenges over there, giving them math authority, et cetera. We've recommended that there be additional information collected for offsetting pension costs for survivors and spouses and Social Security in order to equitably treat people the same under the rules. That hasn't been acted as well. So we've got a long list. Now, in fairness to the Congress, every new Congress, our clock restarts, partially completed. So anything the last Congress did to partially complete, which would have been to introduce a bill, get it marked up through committee. If we get through committee markup, we rate it as partial. And so with this new Congress, sort of the reclock set there. Also, I would say that most of the major savings to date, the $100 billion that's been saved or will be saved, has largely come from congressional action. So just to put it all in perspective.
And that's my point of putting in perspective. So we're being evaluated on whether we are in compliance. You said the clock is reset at everyone, and if it's only partially addressed, if it's made it through committee. Have you ever, or not you, but have the GAO ever considered revising its methodology for determining whether an action is partially addressed by Congress? Have you all had any discussion on that, considering you stated that the clock is resetting every Congress? And so it gives the impression that Congress is not addressing these issues.
Yes. We have not yet, reevaluated the criteria for making these determinations. This is the first time it's come up as an issue, but we'll be happy to take a look at it and see if there's a better way to do that. But we try to provide in the report a balanced perspective. If you just look at the table out of context from the narrative in the report, you can draw the wrong conclusion.
Yes.
But if you read the whole report, I believe you'll get the proper perspective.
Well, I just want to, to the chair and thank you all for being here today, is that clearly here in Congress there's representatives of the people and stewards of the taxpayers' dollars. We should be doing at least as good as the executive branch, if not better. I would respectfully ask that we look at this methodology because we will continuously, as the clock reset, appear to the taxpayers that we are not giving serious actions and considerations to your report. Thank you, and I yield back my time.
We will do that, but I've been informed by my team that only 2 issues have been reset among the recommendations that we have, but we'll take a look at it.
Thank you.
If the gentlelady would yield, I'd just like to point out that the GAO recommendations from last year are in this year's budget that was passed by the House. All right. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Grothman.
Yeah, thanks for being here, and you certainly presented many, many ways for the government to save money, and we hope they all survive the appropriations process. There are two I want to focus on in particular. One is you talk about abuse in children's SSI benefits. And I know recently that the number of people, children who are being described as disabled, has gone through the roof. And of course, there's certainly a lot of anecdotal evidence of severe abuses here. I wonder if you could elaborate on that a little bit.
Yeah, basically I'll ask Ms. Boberg, who's our expert in the area, to elaborate a bit. But the basic issue, Congressman, is that they're supposed to have continuing reviews to see if the situation has improved so that the children, or even adults in that matter, can overcome their disability. But Barb?
Yeah, continuing disability reviews are medical reviews to see if they're still qualified for disability benefits. And the Social Security Administration has really not been doing many for children. And they have told us that the reason for this is that they're husbanding their resources and they've chosen to focus on the adults. But the fact of the matter is they really have not done the level of continuing disability review for any age that they should be doing. This is something that every dollar spent saves $9 in federal funds. And in this case, we were talking about children in supplemental security income, which is a general fund program. But if you think about it also for disability insurance, which is a trust fund funded program, this is a program integrity issue in programs that are going to run out of money. So it's really important that they take this very seriously, because otherwise they will be paying disability benefits for years to people who have medically improved to the extent that they don't any longer meet the eligibility requirements.
Or maybe they weren't disabled in the first place and they slipped between the cracks. Is that possible?
It's always possible, but I like to think that that doesn't happen a lot.
Okay. Do you know right off the top of your head the increase in number of people on SSI, children on SSI?
I don't, but it has gone up. Disability in all categories has gone up in the last several years.
We'll provide the specific numbers for the record.
Okay. Could you elaborate a little bit more on some of your suggestions for the SNAP program?
Well, the one in this year's report is really about how how states who are responsible for managing waste, fraud, and abuse in the food stamp program are trying to discern who is essentially selling their cards. And the guidance given by the Food and Nutrition Service suggests that whenever somebody has gotten 4 replacement cards, you better look at that individual. And in our work, we took to heart that the state said we can't look at all those people, and we're not getting anything from this. We're essentially getting people who have an unstable living environment. You know, they might be homeless and they're losing their cards. They weren't finding people selling their cards. And we found a way that they could use the same data and they could just better target their approach. That we felt that if they looked for someone who asked for 4 replacement cards in 4 different benefit periods, that reduced the number of people they were looking at least in the 3 states that we examined, by almost half. And then they could focus much more greatly on these people who are much more likely to have been selling their cards.
Yeah, we found that there's a greater need to use technology and data analytics and data mining to target federal efforts to find fraud, waste, and abuse. And there really, in some cases, aren't that great of incentives for doing it. This is a case where the federal government pays all the costs, the states are administering the program, and so there's not that great of incentive for them to do this. So we're trying to urge them to use more techniques and to try to urge the federal agency to provide support to the states and urge them to look better at this area.
There were people who didn't believe there was a lot of evidence that people were selling cards?
The ones that they looked at, just on the basis of the 4-card rule, it wasn't panning out for them at the level that you would expect and you would want. And we felt that the states should spend their resources, their limited resources, on the people who are more likely selling the cards. Certainly, you want to look at everybody, but if you don't have the resources, you definitely want to target.
I thank the gentleman. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Russell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you each for being here and for the work that you do. The Social Security Department shows 6.5 million active accounts to Americans that are at least 112 years old or older. Have you run into any of this in your own accounting for the problems that we have on? I mean, we talk a lot about the disability. We know the trouble that it is in. But 6.5 million active accounts of Americans that are 112 years old or older.
Yes. Go ahead, Barb.
We have done work on the Social Security records. We've been very interested in their death records and why you would have people who were 112 and older who were not in the death records is troubling. And I think the Social Security's response to this has been the people that were identified, in particular by their Inspector General most recently, are not active beneficiaries. So we don't really need to verify that because it's not part of our program. But the death records are a very important aspect of program integrity across the federal government. They're shared with other agencies to make sure that we're not sending checks to dead people. And it would be very important to keep that information up to date. So yeah, we're very concerned about that.
Do you think with 6.5 million of them that are still listed as active accounts that maybe some of those might be abused?
Absolutely, and some of them are.
With the things that have been pointed out with TRICARE and Veterans Administration, as a military retiree, I'm on TRICARE for life, which really means TRICARE to 65, and then it rolls over to something else. We went through a gyration in the military, even when I was on active duty, when they revamped to go to TRICARE, and we see a reduction in base hospital and healthcare facilities that could not accommodate, and then they would move you to the local community, and you would receive your care there, which is much what I do now. Even as a member of Congress, I have those exemptions under a different title of law. I pay a copay. I go out, and I, as a veteran of several wars, I have my medical desires met. Do you feel that a construct like that would be adequate to even replace the VA?
Yeah, I don't know if we've...
We haven't done work specifically on that question, but we do know that for many years, before the recent concerns about waiting times at the VA, there were limitations in their ability to take care of all of the veterans. So they've always had a capacity to send veterans out on the market for what they then called fee-basis care. That was greatly expanded through the Choice program. We have very significant concerns, not only in the civilian sector, but actually for all of us about coordination of care in those situations. It's one thing to have the most cost-effective care available. That's critically important, but the quality of that care and the coordination to ensure that the care is actually value-based is where we are really trying to drive care for everybody in both sectors.
I would suggest that the lack of overhead, the lack of payment of salaries, the lack of all of the other things, just paying for the care outright might be a way to solve a lot of the VA issues that we're dealing with. And we have other medical systems that are proving that to be at a rate lower than Medicare, which was the basis of some of your reports. The Department of Defense, it spent $14.4 million in storage of items that have not been requested in over 5 years. For example, a $391 power mast that hasn't been asked for and has cost $8,000 to store in over 5 years, and this while we had active theaters of war in both Iraq and Afghanistan. How do we address the things that, I understand giant gears and things that we might need in some national global emergency, but that's not what we're talking about here. What is being done to address this massive storage problem of things that aren't even asked for in over 5 years?
Sure. This actually is another GAO high-risk area, supply chain management, of which inventory is one of 3 elements of it. There's actually a good news story here in that DOD has paid considerable attention to making sure that they only have the inventory on hand that they need. They set aggressive inventory reduction goals over the past years and largely have achieved them. There's only one remaining area that we're really focused on, is that they maintain the progress that they've made to date, and that they put in a framework to ensure that this continues as leadership changes within the military, that they keep this emphasis and focus. So we think this is actually a good news story, but that DOD needs to continue the progress that it's made in this area.
Thank you, and thank you for your answers. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from New York, Ms. Maloney.
Welcome to all the witnesses. Good to see you again, Mr. De Niro, and I'd like to ask you about the Data Act, which was passed in a bipartisan way by this committee, and it helps reduce duplication by making spending data comparable across all programs. This also allows the executive branch to better measure the costs to the federal government for these investments. When you testified last year before this committee, you said that passing the Data Act, and I quote, "one of the biggest single things that could be done in order to provide more transparency on the cost of these programs and activities," end quote. Do you remember saying that?
Yes.
Can you explain why you believe this, why you believe this so strongly? It's an important statement you made.
Well, one of the areas that we have had the most difficulty in looking at the overlap and duplication in the federal government is lack of good information about what's being spent for all these programs and activities. And the other area that we've identified as a problem is that there's not a lot of good performance measurement or performance evaluation information. So if you don't know what you're spending on a program, and if you don't know whether the program is effective or not, you're really handicapped at making good, intelligent decisions. And for us to be able to advise the Congress on that area, and the American public who fund the government and have responsibility for eventually servicing all the debt that we're accumulating, basically have no visibility into the government's activities on information that they can see what the results are of all the federal government's activities. So if you don't have an informed set of decision makers and elected officials that have access to this data, and the public is not in a good position to have good confidence in government because they can't see what's being done, then I think you have problems. And that's why I said what I did, and I meant it.
And the President signed it into law in the last session. How are we coming about in implementing it? It certainly makes good sense. If you don't have good data, you can't make good decisions, and certainly we need to understand and make comparisons. But it just got passed, I guess, a year ago. So
Right.
When will it be completely implemented in Congress?
Well, it had a phased implementation in the legislation. By May next month, OMB and Treasury are to issue the data standards, and I'm sure Beth can speak to what OMB and Treasury are doing to implement this. Then there's a 2-year period to allow the agencies to prepare to implement the data standards properly, and then GAO and the IGs have audit responsibilities down the road. But I'm going to issue a report to Congress this year. Under the statute, the first report that was asked for was 2017, but I want to give the Congress a good up-to-date report on how its early implementation is going. So you'll get a report from us later this year. I think they're off to a good start, but there's a lot that needs to be done.
When do you expect it to be up and running so you can make these good decisions?
Well,
in 2 years?
Under the law, the 2017 would be the first year that it would be implemented.
Okay. And what are the data, have you compiled the data standards yet, Mrs. Colbert? You're compiling them?
We are working on the data standards that are due in May. There's been an active process of consultation with many different stakeholders inside the executive branch, with Congress, external stakeholders, to get those data standards defined in a way that makes sense. And we have been actively working on that to meet the May deadlines. As Jean said, this is a big focus of our office. We do believe that the Data Act creates real potential to provide better information to decision makers inside all parts of government, and are taking our responsibility to execute against the recommendations and the congressional mandate that's been given to us very, very seriously.
And have there been any unexpected problems that have come up from OMB or Treasury that you've had to address?
It is a complicated process to take financial systems that were in some ways designed for a different purpose and turn them into being used this way. So there is a lot of hard, detailed work. We've requested funding in the FY16 budget to help ensure we can meet the implementation timeline. So we've been working our way through this, and we will continue to be working our way through this according to the timetable that Congress has set out.
Well, my time has expired, but I would be very interested in seeing what your data components are, and I'd like to see if you could give them to the chairman, and maybe he could share them with me, because I really would be interested in seeing them. Congratulations. I think it's a really important project and one we should have already have up and running. So thank you.
I think it would be very helpful to have congressional input into the standards to make sure that they're going to produce the type of data that you would like to see. So I think that's an excellent idea.
Thank you.
I thank the gentlewoman. One follow-up question, Ms. Colbert. So it doesn't sound like you're going to meet the May 9th, or you are going to meet it. So if you're not going to meet it, when could we expect it? Since a lot of this, you've got to get yours in before the rest, so just as a follow-up.
We've been working for the May deadline. That is the path that we're on right now. So, that's the
So if we miss it, we're going to miss it by days and weeks,
yes.
not months
or
or
no,
years.
no.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Palmer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I really love the work you guys are doing. This is, having run a think tank for 20-something years, it's right in my sweet spot, so I commend you for the work you're doing and hope you'll keep it up. Just have a couple of questions about the work you did on the Strategic Petroleum Reserve and the potential for generating revenues by getting that down to a 90-day reserve.
Right.
I think we're in excess of that right now.
Yes. Yeah, that's correct. The international standard is a 90-day supply, considering both government and the private sector having total resources. Right now, the federal government has a 106-day supply. The latest estimate on the private sector is a 141-day supply. We think that it's time to re-examine this, mostly because of the increase in production. We've had a lot of technology improvements. Last years 13 and 14 were some of the most record years of oil production in the United States history. Right. And so we're on track by international standards to be the largest producer in the world. So we think it's a good time to reevaluate this. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve is aging. The infrastructure is aging. We think you could not only sell some of the oil, potentially, depending on the reassessment, to get billions of dollars. You can reduce administrative costs, and then also maybe you could minimize the cost of replacing the infrastructure eventually.
On the private sector, it's holding 141 days. Do you know if that includes what's sitting in tanker cars because they've got nowhere to go with it right now?
Yeah, Mark? Yeah.
I'd be surprised if it includes that. It's very hard to measure these things. We have to rely on the industry self-reporting. But I do know that the numbers Mr. Dodaro was quoting was based on the work we did in December of 2014, the 140-plus days. That's increased, and we think it's over 200 days at this point. And
that's the good news. The bad news is that I think at that time the price was about $65 a barrel, and we're down to 52-something or
right. We looked at
today.
This morning, $56 is what it's based on.
Yeah.
But still, if you look at the other part of this is it's based on the net imports. So when we did the analysis in 14, it was based on net imports for 2013. Looking at net imports for 2014, the number of days has increased as well. So while the prices dropped some, the number of days beyond the 90 has increased substantially.
I'm also looking at the reserves that the federal government owns in places like the Green River Formation. I think there's some interest in expanding our research in the Outer Continental Shelf and the potential for generating revenue to meet our revenue needs, everything from infrastructure to defense to running the government are enormous. Let me ask you, let me switch horses on you here for a moment and go back to the IRS, and I don't know if the GAO has any ideas or on this, and that is the fact that I think we only collect about 84% of the taxes that are owed us. I think we wind up collecting some additional amounts, but on a year-to-year basis. And that has to do, I think, with the difficulty of pursuing these cases, the cost. Does the GAO, have you looked into this, and do you have any recommendations for what the IRS could do to facilitate this so that we actually collect the money that's owed us?
Yes, we've been very concerned about the tax gap between taxes owed and taxes collected. Right now, the latest estimate of IRS is that $385 billion gap between taxes owed and taxes collected under the current structure. We have a long list of recommendations of things that the IRS could do in order to enhance collection activities revolved around a couple of themes. One is getting better return on investment numbers of exactly what tying their initiatives to specific revenue collection activities. They don't have a lot of good data. We illustrated what could be done by shifting, if they shifted based on looking at return on investment, $124 million from field audits, exams, to correspondence audits, they could collect an additional $1 billion. So that's it. We have recommendations to the Congress, two of things Congress could do to increase the collection figures. For example, to allow IRS to set standards for paid tax preparers. Most of the tax returns are people use paid tax preparers. We found that in a lot of cases, when we did undercover operations, sent people into 19 paid tax preparers, only 2 of them gave us the right answers to the questions. So we think this could be something that Oregon has done, some of the states have done, that could be implemented at a broader level. Simplifying the tax code would help greatly in this regard. So we have a lot of recommendations that both IRS and the Congress could implement to address this issue.
Thank you for your work. I yield the balance of my time.
I thank the gentleman. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Walker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Dodaro. Appreciate your time and all the witnesses there. Only 2 have nodded off in the last 30 minutes. No, I'm just teasing there. Yeah, I wouldn't blame you sometimes. But I've got a couple questions here, but I want to get more in depth in the process a little bit. Sometimes we get a little bit more of subjective than objective, and even heard the gentlelady from Michigan talking about if we could only replicate more the way the executive branch operates. And I want to talk a little bit about the process. Obviously, you have a very distinguished career, winning many awards, and except the 2013 Braden Award, most of those awards came before you took over the GAO office. And I don't know if that means you're doing a great job or exactly what. But my question is this, my first question is, when you're implementing or taking action steps, can you talk about the process when you see there's an issue, there's a concern? I'd like to take it from a 30,000-foot perspective and then hone in on a couple of Medicare questions in just a minute.
Yeah, sure. Well, we produce reports, have recommendations in the reports. Agencies will let us know whether they agree with the recommendations or not. In our reports, in addition to making recommendations to executive branch agencies, we also make recommendations to the Congress, matters for the congressional consideration. We have a regular follow-up process on those recommendations. Over a 4-year period, 80% are implemented. On average, last year, implementation of our recommendations resulted in $54 billion in financial benefits to the Federal Government. It's about $100 back for every dollar invested in GAO. About 1,200 non-financial benefits, improvements in public safety and other things that are in place. Now, after a while, if our recommendations aren't implemented, I'll either go to an agency head and say, in fact, we're getting ready to send letters to all the major executive branch agency heads with highlighting key recommendations that are not yet implemented. We'll go to the Congress and try to get the Congress to implement the recommendations in the appropriations process or authorization bill. So a lot of our recommendations get implemented that way through the Congress.
That helps me tremendously. Are most of those self-initiated observations, or do you get those from Congress? How would you come about putting on these smorgasbord of things that need to be done?
Yeah, we do a strategic plan for serving the Congress and the country, looking ahead on a 5-year period of what work we think makes sense in consultation with the Congress, outside experts across government. We receive requests from committee chairs and ranking members and have requirements to do studies in law or in conference or committee reports. Last year we had about 900 requests from the Congress. I'd say about 75% of those are things that we thought were good ideas for us to work on, so it was a collaborative process between GAO and the Congress.
Thank you for addressing that. If you've already apologized for the redundancy, specific question I want to talk to you about. 32 years ago, Congress has required the establishment of criteria. I believe it was 11 cancer hospitals.
Yes.
My question was, I think it was they were exempted from a predetermined Medicare payment.
That's correct.
How does care at these exempted cancer hospitals compare to other hospitals providing similar services? Can you address that?
Yes. I'll ask Ms. Cindy Becerra, who's our head of our health care service, to address that issue.
We were concerned about the issue because when the prospective payment system was put in place many years ago, the cancer hospitals were designated as exempt because at the time the belief was that the payment system wouldn't adequately reflect their costs. It hasn't been revisited since then. We believe now, based on an analysis that we did that compared the populations that were cared for in regular teaching hospitals that are paid under the prospective system and the PCH hospitals, that in fact there aren't differences in outcomes and that the care is comparable. So we believe, based on that analysis, that the savings to up to about $500 million.
Okay, you just took my second question there. Are you feel good about estimating a number there that we could save?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, you said about around?
It's $166 million on the inpatient side and about $303 on the outpatient side.
It's about $500 million a year could be saved.
Okay. Thank you. I appreciate that, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Walberg.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the panel for being here. And Mr. Dodaro, I wish you could have talked about comprehensive tax reform a little longer. And as I sit here and listen, I am constantly brought back to the fact that maybe just perchance we've let the federal government get too large. But I appreciate the work you're doing in looking into what's going on. Relative to FOIA review process, DHS has the largest backlog of any federal agency. How does the duplicative processing, like with USCIS and ICE, where USCIS processes certain requests, then sends requests to ICE, which processes them a second time? They had a different working relationship earlier on. How does that duplicative processing of requests contribute to the backlog?
It's a great contributor. I'll ask Mr. Ponder to explain why that happens, but we think it can be streamlined.
So they have one of the largest backlogs of FOIA requests. So if you start with that, you want to streamline operations. So if you look at what USCIS does at CBP, they have an agreement where they don't duplicate efforts. And what we looked at, we saw a situation where ICE and USCIS, they were duplicating. So our recommendation was really to follow that memorandum of agreement that USCIS and CBP has in place, and that would actually help the backlog.
Yeah, so you have three different components of the Department of Health or Homeland Security. Two of the components have an agreement. They don't duplicate. The third component doesn't have the agreement with ICE. So you have inconsistencies even within the department.
Why weren't they able to come to an agreement like they had in the past? What kept them from that?
I think a lot of it's just a history of how they've done it in the past, and culture and bureaucracy on how they process that information. It's their information, so they want to process it instead of letting another organization do it. That's what CBP does with USCIS, is they say it's okay for USCIS to process the FOIA request using our data, where ICE doesn't have that level.
Do we see any movement that direction?
Not to date. Not to date. That was a recent report that we issued, but we're continuing to monitor.
One of the things that I have, I mentioned I'm sending letters to the agency heads. This is one area I want to point out. I have frequent conversations, particularly with the deputy for the Department of Homeland Security, so I'm going to mention it to them too, see if we can get some movement.
Okay. Ms. Colbert, in GAO's 2011 report found that tracking undispersed balances and expired grant accounts could facilitate the reallocation of scarce resources or returning funding to the Treasury. Per GAO's recommendation, OMB has instructed executive departments and agencies to take action to address undispersed balances in expired grant accounts. GAO's 2011 report highlighted issues related to undispersed balances in expired grant accounts. OMB implemented GAO's recommendation, and the action is considered fully addressed. What made this instance different from the other cases that OMB has not yet addressed?
Thank you for describing that particular instance. It's an example of the many places where we work closely with GAO on trying to take what they learn from their work and work together both within OMB and across agencies to put things into action. The recommendations there were very clear, and we were able to pursue that through our normal oversight of grants, which is done through the Office of Federal Financial Management, actually part of my responsibilities at OMB. We are also on a number of other areas working to implement the GAO reports, whether it's on elements around strategic sourcing, portfolio stat we discussed earlier, data center consolidation. In our mind, the input we get from GAO is extremely valuable in helping us set our agenda for working together with agencies. And in fact, in particular, for example, on things like the high-risk list, Gene and I have meetings together with the relevant agencies. We sort of work our way through the high-risk list on a monthly basis because we think it's important to take these things seriously.
So there is follow-up between the two.
Absolutely.
Are agencies responding?
Agencies are responding. You can see that in the number of reports of the number of action items that have been addressed fully or partially. Some of those are through OMB actions, some of those are through agency actions. And where they haven't been addressed, we're continuing to try and understand what's getting in the way. Sometimes they may have the same diagnosis of the problem as GAO, a slightly different view on what the right solution is, and that's where we enter into an active dialogue to say, what's the best way to try and get at the root problem we're trying to solve.
Well, I wish you success, and
thank you.
I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Carter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank all of you for being here. This is very important and very informative, and we appreciate it very much. Mr. Dorado, I want to speak. I know that the previous congressman questioned you about DHS, but I'd like to go further into that, and it's important to me for two reasons. First of all, I'm a member of the Homeland Security Committee, so it's important for that reason. But secondly, and perhaps most importantly, I have a bill, one of my first bills that I've introduced, House Resolution 1615, that deals with this. As you know, the Department of Homeland Security has more FOIA requests than any other department. And not only that, but right now, the backlog of all federal FOIA requests, the Department of Homeland Security has more than half, which is really alarming. Now, again, I want to ask you, because my legislation really calls for the elimination of duplication. And I want to ask you again about USCIS and then ICE and the duplication there. Is there indeed duplication in that process? Are they both processing the FOIA request separately? So your office acknowledges and believes that they are indeed doing that. Okay, well, let me ask you, it's my understanding that, that Customs and Border Protection and USCIS have an agreement in which they work together on these FOIA requests, yet ICE does not have that same agreement?
Correct. And our recommendation is to replicate that agreement that those two organizations have.
Did they give a reason why they don't have that agreement? Is there?
No, there was some back and forth about was it actually duplicative or not, and some hand-wringing there. But the issue here is they both process some of the same FOIA requests. There is duplication. There's an opportunity to reduce it by having that agreement. This is a pretty straightforward issue. This is really a simple one.
Okay, it's my understanding that at one point they did have an agreement.
They did
and
at one time, and it expired, yes, and they have not revisited that. So this is very straightforward.
It's hard to explain some type of behavior that happens at times within large bureaucracies, and I don't profess to give you a really good answer as exactly why.
Can you turn your mic on?
I'm sorry, excuse me. What I was saying is, you know, it's sometimes hard to explain behavior in large bureaucracies, and I don't profess to try to explain exactly why it is what it is. All we know is that it's not correct the way it is. It's contributing to the backlog and needs to be changed. So if your bill can help in that regard, I think it would be a terrific idea.
Well, certainly we want to push this issue because it would appear to me that not only would it help with the backlog, obviously, but it would be less expensive to do it that way.
That's correct.
You know, since I've been up here all of 3.5 months, common sense, I'm not sure that I've figured out where it's hiding at.
Sometimes it's not so common.
Well, you're exactly right. But again, it's my understanding that these two subgroups, if you will, sub-organizations of Homeland Security have established a study committee of sorts to work through this. Are you aware of that? Are they working on it? What's the status of it currently?
I'm not. I'll have to get you a status for the record. I'm not aware of the working group, so we'll get back to you on that.
Okay, well, if you could, that would be very important because obviously this is a bill that's very important to me. I think should be very important to all of us to get rid of this backlog. Again, over half of the federal FOIA requests that are in backlog now are in Homeland Security. No excuse for that whatsoever, and no excuse for the duplication. So thank you for your efforts, and please watch this bill very, very closely.
We will.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield the remainder of my time.
I thank the gentleman. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Micah.
Thank you, Chairman Meadows, and Mr. Dodaro. Welcome, Ms. Colbert. One of the things we've worked on, in fact, work closely with Mr. Meadows, is my interest in fulfilling the findings we did in a report some years ago. The title of it was "The Federal Government Must Stop Sitting on Its Assets." And we looked at properties as one part of it, and we've actually taken that on. I think you've endured a few of our hearings. We had some pretty good successes when you drive down Pennsylvania Avenue and you see the old post office building that was costing us $6 to $8 million a year. Will soon be a 5-star hotel and first-class commercial center, probably employing 1,000 people and paying us. I think the deal we got was about $250,000 a month plus a percentage of the gross. Not too bad. And other properties, but unfortunately the successes are fairly limited. DOD, for example, under the information I've gotten from staff and I think from you all, says that DOD has 560,000 facilities worldwide, and as of September, only had a utilization rate of 53%. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Who's going to identify yourself?
Yeah, just to clarify that, there was only data in DOD's real property database for 53% of the facilities. So basically,
So that's all you could confirm.
You're right.
Yeah,
and the
because we
data
found in the past, and I think some of your work too. It was one, agencies didn't know what they had. They didn't know the conditions. Sometimes they didn't, their inventory was never updated, and then whether it was utilized was a totally different question.
Yeah, that's correct, Congressman. And that
Now,
data,
but the other thing, too, is I think that GAO has recommended that OMB develop a national strategy that could provide a pathway to manage excess and utilize excess and underutilized property. You recommended this?
yes, yes.
And how are they doing on it? They got it all done? They've got a good plan?
Well, they've just produced a strategy document a couple of weeks ago, toward the end of...
Couple of weeks ago?
Right, right. And we looked at it. We think it's a good first step.
Okay. You recommended that, as I recall, back in June of 2012. So that's probably lightning rocket speed to get it last week. So, all right. OMB, I've got a... And DOD, I've got a specific case in Florida. About a year or so ago, I dragged one of the subcommittees down. We have, you know, when you have public assets and we're sitting on them, you got to look in your own backyard. And at Cape Kennedy, have 144,000 acres that NASA has. They've been out of some of that business for 5 years now. And they have 500 buildings. Half of them are vacant or underutilized. 144,000 acres. That's 6 times the size of Manhattan. Then next to it is the Air Force property, which is 16,000 acres. I'm not talking about Patrick. I'm talking next to it. So I held a hearing, and we had people laid out. The port director came over and said, if I could get 50 to 200 acres more right adjacent, which the Air Force controls, I could create 5,000 jobs by making a cargo container port out of it. Last week, and this guy's gone, Carter's gone, he said common sense. He's been here 3 months. I've been here 23 years, Carter, and you're not here to hear this, but it doesn't prevail. Last week, they told him that they couldn't, we'll send them a tape, videotape, but common sense would be, they want less than 200 acres of 16,000, and last week they basically rejected a sole source to the port. The port only happens to be the only entity in Florida that's allowed to do port work at this site at Port Canaveral, and they couldn't give them a sole source. OMB, DOD, somebody, can anybody, does anyone know, can you look into sole sourcing?
I'd be happy to.
Could you review this and tell me what idiotic determination would prohibit? I get a few more minutes because he yielded back 41 seconds before he
Gentleman
exited.
is recognized for another minute.
I'd be happy to look into that and get back to you around.
No, I mean, this is nutcases. We did the hearing down there. We got them to, the port gave an unsolicited proposal, and they came back, and the Navy is a sublease to that. They'll move them, pay for it. They need slight reconfiguration, and they rejected it last week. I just need to know the impediments, because there's a way to do this. You have to be a persistent bastard, first of all, and then you got to find a way to make this work. 5,000 jobs, I don't know, that wouldn't be important in your district, would it, Mr. Meadows?
Indeed it would.
Okay, and he was telling the whole truth and nothing but the truth. Well, if you could answer that, you would make my day. Looking at that one case, I'll send you, we'll give you a copy. It doesn't necessarily have to be part of the record, but it's such a struggle. We are working with Mr. Chaffetz, with the committee. We had several bills for disposal of property and trying to straighten out that process. Usually we find the agencies are not able to make decisions. They sit on it. No one in DOD could have an initiative. No one in GSA could have an initiative. No one in almost any agency. I got a list of the VA properties. It would go from here to the vacant properties to the end of the dais. There's so many. But we do need a mechanism to better utilize valuable public assets. Thank you, and I yield back 2 seconds. Thank you.
I thank the gentleman from Florida. I'm going to close this out without going into a lot of additional questions. You've been very gracious, both of you, with your time. I do want to say, Mr. Dodaro, thank you so much for your leadership in a nonpartisan way, and a real thank you to your entire staff for the work that you do. It gives us the tools to work with, not only here but at OMB, and so we just want to compliment you on a job well done. Obviously, there are a number of areas that we would like to address, and so I would ask your staff to work with us, if they would, on those ones that require legislative directives. If you could put those in a list with a dollar amount. Everybody's looking for offsets, right. And so I think that that would be very good. We've heard some today. Ms. Colbert, I want to follow up. Mr. Miker talked about this whole aspect. I've got a real estate background, and based on the way that we manage our real estate portfolio, it's costing us. It's not just the assets that are sitting there, it's the management of those assets that become real dollars. I know that you've made progress. I know that you've had some changes at OMB, and I gave some time from the last Congress. I have a long memory, though, and in the year time frame that I gave is coming up this July. The progress of which we're making on that particular issue, it would take 234 years to dispose of all the property that we have. That's longer than our country's been in existence, and so we can do better than that. And I say that only to say that we're going to continue to look at that, even if it is coming up with a creative way to make sure that when you dispose of the property or GSA disposes of it, it goes back to the agency. It's better that we deal with it than just to let it sit there. Would you agree?
We'd be happy to continue the dialogue with you about practical ways to move the ball forward. We know there's things there, that opportunities that can be captured, and we'd be very interested in continuing the conversation with you and others about how to move the ball forward faster.
So I'm going to ask this last request, and that has to do with really what we know as tax expenditures and the way that they go into the budget and are accounted for. Do I have both of your commitments to work very closely together so that we can really fine-tune that number from a budget standpoint to know what it's costing us in terms of credits, tax deductions, et cetera, so that we can make better informed decisions? I see a nodding yes, so I would assume that's a yes.
My team will tell you that I'm a data geek, so better data is always helpful.
Okay. Well, we're going to get along just fine, so thank you so much. Thank the witnesses. I want to thank the staff here for all their hard work. And with that, if there's no further business, without objection, the committee stands adjourned.